Mr. Nair, you call China a democracy. How do you justify this?
Why wouldn't you think it's a democracy? So that's my answer to your question. And I think that question is essentially answered by the fact that we view democracy as essentially that
Electoral system?
That performative thing called the electoral system.
Welcome to COGGS. We're joined by Mr. Chandran Nair here in New Delhi. He is the CEO and founder of Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur-based think tank Global Institute for Tomorrow, which closely looks at the political shift of geoeconomic and political influence from West to Asia. He has authored 3 excellent titles. One of his recent titles is Consumption Needs, and Asia's role is reshaping capitalism and serving the planet. The other one is the Sustainable State. Mr. Chandran was the chairman of Environmental Research Management in Asia Pacific. Chandran has served as adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He is member of Executive Committee of the Club of Rome as well as a fellow of prestigious Royal Society of Arts. We have seen his works in World Economic Forum as well. Mr. Nair, welcome to COGGS. Thank you for joining in.
I think the World Economic Forum then, as the sort of the narratives around consumption, etc., and capitalism evolved and became more extreme, I think a bit lost sight of that, and I think some of the founders are aware of that. So the main accusation of the World Economic Forum is that it's essentially a club of elites. I go there not I go there as one of the panel of experts. I'm invited. I was on the Agenda Councils and now an expert panel, and people like us are invited to share our thoughts. My thoughts are quite often dissenting, and I think that is necessary. But I do think the World Economic Forum needs to transform dramatically. But more importantly, I think there needs to be other forums.
The alternative of World Economic Forum?
I don't like to call it...
Who will host it? Beijing?
I don't like to call it alternatives. I mean, the World Economic Forum was not started by the Swiss government. It was started by one man who had an idea. So, my institute is creating something called Nexus. We just launched it 2 months ago. And I don't like to call it as an alternative, but it's a platform for a new world. And its mantra is advancing humanity through the purposeful economy. In that one line, we capture what I view as the most important things that business leaders, academics, politicians should think about. What does advancing humanity mean in the 21st century? There are very few conversations about that in the context of then the second part of that our subtext, through a purposeful economy. So what is a purposeful economy? And so I think we need different platforms, intellectually robust, where you're bringing the new actors of the 21st century, and the World Economic Forum and other forums essentially are dominated by 20th century actors like the multinationals and all of that. And there are a whole bunch of new things happening. And our global platform called Nexus. So you said, is it Beijing? Why do you say Beijing? It's individuals. We think tanks, just like Klaus Schwab's created the World Economic Forum.
Yes.
So we are creating one, and it's based out of Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur.
Okay, I see. So from the leadership chair of Global Institute for Tomorrow, do you think the global corporate bodies and MNCs from the global South nation will have more things to say in the global order? And also the consumption will be based on their desires?
Well, unless governments start to essentially recognize that the discussions about sustainability are much more profound, the oversimplification of these ideas and some sort of environmental protection. It's part of the political economy, it's how you price things and how you make resources available. I don't think the private sector or multinationals would be there based in Asia or in the non-Western economies will shift, because they've all bought into the idea that their success and their growth should not be in any way hindered by any new approaches to dealing with what everyone knows are existential threats. So it's incumbent on governments to do this, and I've argued very strongly, although I come from a business background, I work with multinationals. Multinationals don't do public good. They do shareholder good.
I see.
That doesn't make them bad people, but that's what they're wired to do. The CEO or board, they were not created, these people were not chosen to protect public and common goods.
I see.
They were chosen to protect shareholder value, that's what they will do. And therefore, but because there's a demand for public and common good, they will create, through their allies, the business schools and consultants, narratives that suggest that they have public and common goods at heart. They don't. It doesn't make them evil. It's just not their jobs.
Mr. Nair, we've seen how Malaysia has employed the youths from the Global South nation and also has upskilled them. Do you think the other Global South nation, be it from ASEAN or from Latin America or from South Asia, have the capability of upskilling and employing the youth? And what are the challenges on youth upskilling and employment?
I mean, I don't know where you heard that Malaysia has done this very well. I will give credit where it's due if Malaysia has done it in some areas, but we have a huge problem of upskilling in Malaysia. It's a more complex issue of the education system. It's also a complex view of the politics. Everything is politics, particularly when you have race-based politics, as we do in my country. But we are not, at the bottom of the pile. So upskilling skills, and particularly in India, is going to be a huge challenge. And can other countries do it? Of course they can do it, but you have to have institutions that are strong. You have to have leaders that
What
are
sort of
strong.
institution? Is it the government institution
Of
or
course.
For the private?
No, the private sector can contribute in some ways, but you have to have the institutions of society, which is the government, to lead that. You have to have vision. You have to put in large amounts of money, training institutions, etc. And I know the examples, small scale, Singapore is a great example of doing this, but it is small. Large scale, I would say China. Again, really increasing productivity, taking over. But these are very large countries. And I have been listening to Indian politicians, etc., saying one of the biggest challenges for India to industrialize and take advantage of its demographic, youth bulge, etc., is upgrading the skills. For that, you need a complete, I think, a shift. But that shift has to be driven by great political will, and existing institutions have to retool completely to deliver on that social mission to upskill. And I think there are many other Indians who are much more well versed in this, but who've lamented the fact, even recently, that India is not there yet. So it can be done, it has to be done. Otherwise, you're leaving a generation of youth, younger people, unskilled, and particularly in an age where technology seems to be, a threat, in my view, to people able to deploy their labor. My God, it's never more important that governments have to pay close attention to this, and that is not simply about retooling people with IT skills. It's a whole host of other things.
Yes.
We need masons, we need plumbers, we need people who can build roads, a whole host of other things, and very importantly, grow food. Those are all skills.
What sort of challenges the Global South will face in the next decades? As an economist, what would you say?
In my view, what you call the Global South, I call the global majority.
Okay.
The biggest challenge is that these are the most populated parts of the world. most populated parts of the world will be most threatened by the existential threats. The existential threats start with climate and therefore biodiversity loss, food, water, and all of those things. So these are the most important things. And in my view, there are millions of jobs to be created around this. And I think governments should be very careful about simply being seduced by ideas coming out from Silicon Valley, where people have no clue about how the real world works, and thinking these will create jobs. But if you identify the threats, if you have a clear idea about what your region, your country needs to look like in 30 years, given an honest appraisal of the threats today, then you will have a plan. But far too many governments and the economists who guide them refuse, are in denial of these threats because either they're ill-informed or they are just loyal to their discipline and therefore actually not qualified to look at this. So you have to look at the macro picture and look, so what's the world threatened by? What will large populations have to contend with? And therefore, then how do we essentially look at how do we organize our societies? Coming back to my point about how do you harness all that hidden potential and how do you redefine what the political philosophy of the country is. But if you simply go on saying we need foreign direct investments, we need more AI and this and that, without saying, well, which problem are we actually trying to solve? Rather than just get on that train of, yes, more technology of everything, but which problem are you trying to solve? And I would say that in India, I would imagine the biggest challenge going forward in the country will be the most populated, 1/3 the size of China in terms of land mass. I would have thought the most important challenge would be how are we going to feed everybody, given the risk of climate change, and we've seen some of the data in terms of places in India, not only but other parts, becoming uninhabitable to people, crop failures, etc. AI is not going to solve your problem. AI can help you identify, but you're going to have to organize on a large scale. And you're going to have to make political trade-offs. So I think these are the things that developing countries need to define the narrative. The solutions for this and even the thought process of this are not going to come from the USA, Canada, or the UK, or from Harvard University. They're going to come from here, because this is not rocket science, but you have to be bold enough to think, what are we looking at? Then you apply the best science and technology and know-how to project into the future and think about these things. And therein lies a great contradiction today, where people just simply keep talking about technology, limiting technologies to something digital, and not understanding that water treatment is a technology, toilets are a technology, farming techniques are technologies, all of these things. But you have to say technology for what?
The technology for irrigation, for example, the kind of Israel uses, India wanted to implement it for saving waters. That is highly essential.
And even what are you educating people in? The same old education. And if you have an education, what will it be used for? That's the critical thinking aspect of what is education. And I've argued that a lot of the education that we today have is kind of unsuited to what the challenges are. And I'm not talking about technology, I'm talking about how would people live in a very different world.
I see. What sort of industries will boom in an ASEAN region, or what sort of corporation will demolish in an Southeast Asian region?
It depends again on this question about what do you see the next 40, 50 years is. So in ASEAN, I've argued that the most important thing is to ensure that a population of 1 billion have access to food, safe shelter, water supply and sanitation, and importantly, healthcare. So the boom, if you want to call it, I would start with making sure food security is the number one priority. And food security to achieve food security, it's a complex set of things. So a lot of thought needs to be given to it. Far too little, in my view, is being thought about it. I don't think governments are on top of this at all, because they are prioritizing that same old development model of the latest thing now is this digital technology and that digital technology, without fundamentally asking the question, is it going to solve our food security problem? Is climate change going to make this happen? Is biodiversity loss going to do this? Is water scarcity going to do this? So the areas where we really have to focus on, I would think, is low-cost housing using the latest in material science and things like that. New financing models to essentially allow access to these things. New business formulations to do all of this. So it requires very new thinking, and then the advanced technologies we have hopefully will enable us to navigate them, and the industries of the future will grow. But the industries of the future will have to address the fundamental questions that human beings need. Food security, clean air, clean water, and recreation space, healthcare. I think this obsession with, a minority of rich countries essentially deciding whether large developing countries will succeed or not through FDI, it's a very odd way of looking at things. So I've always talked about the need for intra-regional investments, etc. And the world is a big place, and therefore, advanced nations who, let's face it, many of them are not that rich, and if companies come in, okay. But it is almost, in my view, embarrassing to see large nations and delegations going and hawking themselves to tech titans in the West, automotive companies, as though this is the only way we can develop. It's an old way of thinking, right? I think intra-regional trade is important, investments, etc. But there's a lot that can be done internally by printing your own money too, which is a different topic I will talk about, but which I have spoken about. So this way of thinking about development is depending on foreign direct investments is archaic. We have to think about things slightly. Our gods would appreciate us because we would be protecting the sacred rivers.
Mr. Nair, you call China a democracy. How do you justify this?
Why wouldn't you think it's a democracy? So that's my answer to your question. And I think that question is essentially answered by the fact that we view democracy as essentially that
electoral system,
that performative thing called the electoral system, carried out once every 5 years or 4 years, depending on where we are. And that's the end of it. We have a democracy. The people have said what they want to say. My view, and we have seen how democracies in the West are essentially
the Westphalian democracies.
Yeah, and no one wishes them bad, but you can see how they are essentially becoming more authoritarian in the terms of the people they elect. And no matter what they do, they say, well, we have a democracy, so the people have chosen. So fine. But ultimately, why do you have a system of governance? You have a system of governance to essentially ensure that there's social justice in place, that government system, the institutions of the state are able to organize the economy, which is not simply about we need more industrialization. The economy is a much more complex thing than that. But organize the economy, the productive forces that are available to that society to deliver goods and services that I always say ensure, there's no perfect solution, that ensures that the majority of people do not suffer from the drudgery of life. What's the drudgery of life? It's access to food safe and secure, which is a major thing in the world we live in. Water and sanitation, already mentioned, is a basic human right and dignifies people's lives, makes it much healthier, etc. A proper shelter, which many people in the world increasingly are deprived of, particularly as extreme climates begin to impose their impact on people, public health care and education. And that's important for what it does.
So in your views, the public infrastructure represents the democratic values, not participatory elections?
Well, if it can elect leaders who can deliver on that, and that's why I teasingly say, and this is not just my data, if you look at the World Bank, the UN, the Chinese system has delivered that for the vast majority of its people. What would you rather have? And this again is controversial. More freedom of speech, or you want people to have a dignified way of life where they understand our freedoms are not unfettered, but we are essentially safe, stable, and we have the what I call the basic rights to life.
Does that ensure equality as well? Do you think China has an equal society?
Does India have an equal society?
Of course not.
Of course not. I would say China, there's no such thing as an equal society. Name me one. There's none. So there are inequalities to all societies, and the role of the state is to try and even things out. What we have seen in so-called democratic societies, which have essentially been captured by extreme capitalism, like the United States today, there's extreme inequality. The poverty, the homelessness, the lack of sanitation in parts of, what is just few kilometers away from Silicon Valley, you will not see in China anymore. You will not see people defecating on the street. You will not see people carrying guns and shooting in schools, etc. So what is equality? What is freedom? And that's the discussion I think we ought to be having. And I often say, if you're poor today, would you rather be Chinese or Indian? Is another provocative question that one would ask. So there is no equality, but there is a right for people to live safe, secure lives. And that's what the institutions of the state, the government, has an obligation. How it does it is through different methods, but my experience has been that it's an exaggeration to say that electoral democracies deliver. They don't necessarily.
I see. Do you think China is a perfect model for eradicating poverty from the global South nations?
No. And I think the Chinese model cannot...
Deng Xiaoping's model is your favorite for adopting?
No. The Chinese model works for China because each economy is culturally different. China is a civilization in its own. The norms are different. China understands the role of authority, which, in many other countries is seen as essentially a curb on your freedoms. So the Chinese system cannot be exported elsewhere. Each country has to develop its own. But I will argue that in large countries, and this is what my second book talked about, the sustainable state, large countries, and this is one of the talks I did in India, in Delhi today, large countries will have to find a different political, economic system to deal with this, because electoral democracy is weak in terms of being able to create more equitable societies, large numbers of people, over 500 million people, in an era of constraints. So India will have to find its own way, given that it inherited a political system which was, from the colonial masters. It was not its own creation, or maybe it's most suited. Now the inefficiencies of that system India has to India has to use. I am in no way suggesting that the Chinese system will work in India. In fact, it will fail dismally. But what will that Indian system be, given that so many Indians still, as you know, do not have what I call the basic rights to life and that dignity? And I think this is the question. I mean, what happens in Malaysia, who cares, in a way, and all due respect to my Malaysian fellow citizens, because Malaysia is or let's take Australia even, who cares? It's 22 million people, good luck. But what happens in India is huge. 1.5 billion people coming up. What happens in China is really huge. What happens in Nigeria, Indonesia is really huge. And it'll all depend on the nature of the political system. But I think just the suggestion that India is a democracy, it should do it this way, etc., and not understand it has to adjust, given the complexities of the 21st century, is denying the search for new social, social constructs to manage the 21st century.
In your books, Consumptionomics, you have mentioned about the consumption culture. How do you look at the global South nations' consumption culture, especially from South Asia and in Southeast Asia?
Well, consumption is a necessity for human life, right? We have to consume food, we have to consume energy, we consume water and all of that.
Don't you think there's a surge in consumption of luxury items, especially of digital gadgets and...
Yeah, so my book essentially said that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that a market economy driven by the desire, by the need to promote relentless consumption, buy things you don't need with money you don't have, and to impress people you don't like if you're middle class, is unsustainable. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to know this. And I go through various things, from car ownership right through to the amount of meat you eat. It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable to the point we're already seeing the consequences of this in all aspects of how natural systems work. Climate is just tip of the iceberg. So the problem is that I argue in the book that the global majority have, for some reason, well, not for some reason, because most of the world was colonized by the Western powers, etc., have just followed that economic model, and
yes.
The institutions of the world were created by that time.
Yes.
And therefore they think there's no other alternative. Now, there are lots of vested interests who are very keen on perpetuating that system. I argue about those, I put that argument forward in my third book called Dismantling Global White Privilege.
Yes.
Because there's institutional global implications for that. So the struggle now is how do we break away from that? Because you don't need to be, again, a rocket scientist to understand that, if Indians consume like the average American, then game over. There's simply not enough to go around. But overconsumption is not hardwired into people's DNA. The idea of consuming fast foods is not something that most civilizations had. It was a peculiar invention in the United States, and then it was, exported around the world. But consuming healthy food, having access, that is just a facet of the fact that human beings essentially need to consume. But we can't consume in the economic model today, which essentially, the main point I was making in the book, is allows you to consume through underpricing resources and externalizing costs. And the carbon one is just one part of the example. We underprice fossil fuels so that we can all overuse it. The producers of essentially fossil fuels-based energy systems are constantly interested in producing more and getting people to use it more, and having pricing systems that allow you to wastefully use it. So waste is built into that consumption model, and I argue this is simply not possible, and we'll have to price things accordingly. So I argue for it. I think it can only be good. I think most importantly, apart from the economic deals, etc., which I think again too much attention is paid to. Not all of them are necessarily growth that we should have, but it'll happen. It's essentially the trust that needs to be built within China and the ASEAN nations. There's a long history, there's a large Chinese diaspora in the region, so that's all good. And the most important thing is peace. If you have peace and stability, then nation states can do all the things I've talked about, both internally,
okay.
They can trade with others, and very importantly with this is for ASEAN region not to get involved and be caught up in the geopolitics in terms of the competition between the US and China. And I think China is our neighbor. China is in the region. China will be our close friend. And we have to find ways to make sure that we don't get caught up in the big power rivalry between the US, which is on the other side of the planet,
Yes.
and us. And this is really, really important. And I spoke about this earlier today, and I actually said that China-India relationships will be, in my view, the most consequential relationships, not in a binary fashion, but because both of the two most populous countries in the world working together can only be good for each other, but will have ripple effects far and wide, and especially in ASEAN.
Thank you, Mr. Nair. Thank you for joining on COGGS. Thank you for sharing the details of global geoeconomics with our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you.